Chapter 1151 Deceit in a Hotel in the Backland Bridge area. Apart from his thoughts that still belonged to him, Klein could no longer control anything else. Even his eyeballs couldn't move. He knew very well that this was likely a deeper level of parasitizing. In this state, he could only look ahead of him in fear and despair. He watched as Enuni, who was wearing a monocle with a smile on his face, changed into Amon's original form. He took a step forward counterclockwise and opened his mouth to speak in Mandarin in an articulate and mellow manner. The immortal Lord of heaven and earth for blessings, did he steal my thoughts just now, or my ability to speak Mandarin? It should be the former, otherwise, he wouldn't be able to grasp this ritual. Klein's pupils couldn't widen as he watched. He felt an unprecedented sense of anxiety. As though sensing his emotions, the monocled man turned to look at him and smiled. He then took another step counterclockwise and whispered in Mandarin, the Sky Lord of heaven and earth for blessings. Following that, this blasphemer carried on the ritual with great familiarity. With every step he took, and every chant of the incantation, Klein's heart sank even deeper into a dark swamp, as though he could no longer see any light. The celestial worthy of heaven and earth for blessings. When Amon took the final step and recited the final incantation, a boundless grayish-white fog suddenly appeared in front of Klein. He heard layers of pleas. There was no need to listen carefully, as he understood what it meant with his spiritual perception. After advancing to Scholar of Yore, he had obtained basic control over Sapphira Castle. No matter who it was, even if they had the correct ritual and corresponding incantation, they needed to obtain his permission to enter the world above the gray fog. Reject him. Klein was instantly delighted as this idea clearly surfaced within him. However, just as he had this thought, he had forgotten it. Standing there, he looked like a statue carved from stone. His intention of rejecting Amon had been stolen by him. Klein once again felt despair, but the grayish-white fog in front of him and the prayers in his ears didn't disappear. Klein was first taken aback before he understood what was going on. I understand. I have to head above the gray fog myself and control Sapphira Castle to give him permission to enter. There is no default option. This thought was like a straw which Klein grabbed at without any hesitation. It prevented himself from sinking into the water silently without anyone hear him cry. Although he still didn't know how to make use of this matter, his intuition told him that a slim possibility and his only hope could be hidden in this detail. At this moment, Amon stopped the attempt and cast his gaze at Klein. Clearly, he had failed to successfully enter Sapphira Castle. This angel of time adjusted the monocle on his right eye and smiled without any change in expression. Honorable Mr. Fool, your idea of saving yourself is very interesting. Amon had used the standard loan language, but every word seemed to be able to stir the powers of nature, creating one explosion after another in his mind. How is he so sure that I'm the fool and not the blessed of the fool? Klein felt his body turn cold as the hope that had just surfaced sank into the water once more. How am I certain? Amon sked and pulled the chair from before over and sat down. He pointed at the round stool opposite him and said, "Sit down, don't stand on ceremony." The moment he finished his sentence, Klein couldn't help but stride forward and sit on the round stool. Amon looked around the room and grabbed Klein's black silk top hat. He put it on his head and said with a smile, "Did you think that I wasn't aware that the ritual would be unsuccessful? It hasn't been long since Sapphira Castle produced an anomaly, so how could I forget? I just want to see your reaction. And you subconsciously felt despair and instinctively rejected me. That was very interesting. If you weren't the one who was called the fool, how could you have such thoughts? Dear Mr. Fool, am I right?" As he repeated the four rhetorical questions, Amon looked rather pleased, as though he was an old hunter who had caught the fox's tail. I fell for his scam. Only then did Klein realize why Amon wasn't disappointed at all. He subconsciously wanted to deny it, but after some thought, he calmly said, "Kill me." I can speak now. Klein tried to control his body, but it was completely impossible. In the next second, he was prepared to recite the honorific name of the Evernight goddess, but this thought was immediately lost. The thin-faced blasphemer Amon pressed down on his right monocle and maintained his excited state from before. So that you can be reborn in Sapphira Castle, the more I talk to this fellow, the more mistakes I make. Klein shut his mouth tightly and didn't say another word. When Amon saw this, he shook his head with a smile. There's no need to be so afraid. Actually, there's no bad blood between us. Sitting on the round stool like a doll, Klein was stunned for a moment, but he didn't respond. Amon leaned forward slightly and looked into his eyes before continuing with a smile. The only conflict we have is regarding Sapphira Castle. But do you really wish to shoulder that fate? Aren't you worried that the original owner of Sapphira Castle will revive within you? This was something Klein was very concerned about, making him at a loss for words. Amon pinched the crystal monocle and didn't urge him to answer. He smiled and said, if you give me Sapphira Castle, all the problems will be resolved. That way, whether the original owner of Sapphira Castle comes back to life, or if the corresponding fate can be shouldered, the person who needs to worry is me, not you. Also, I'll be the one to take over the subsequent arrangements of my zealous brother, Dor, and Lil Zeradal's pursuits and the benediction of Evernight. And you will be freed from all this and just stay as a Sequence 3. Heh, why would I want to kill you? What's the point of killing a Sequence 3? Even if I want to retrieve the characteristic, it's still expendable. My prey will only be Palez, Lil Zeradal, and Dor. The rest will purely depend on my mood. As for the organization that you established, I can also help you maintain it. It's very fascinating and interesting. If you think this price isn't enough, then I can make you my blessed. Heh, are you not pretending that the fool is the angel of time Amon in the City of Silver? This can turn into a reality in the future. I will lead them out of the forsaken land of the gods and see the light outside. When the time comes, you'll still have a chance to advance to Sequence 2 and become an angel. This is practically taking over all my worries and hardships. There are only benefits left. Klein, who didn't have a huge desire in becoming a true god and controlling Sapphira Castle, heard his heart palpitate with excitement. If he hadn't known that Amon was the #1 master in deceit, he would have agreed to it on the spot. But in the end, he still said without any expression, kill me. Is that the only thing you know how to say? Amon said without any signs of anger. He looked at Klein with piqued amusement. To him, this was a very interesting matter. It was completely understandable that he would encounter difficulties during the process. They only served to make success even more fulfilling and delightful. I'm just a heartless broken record. By lampooning, Klein eased his depression and despair. Instead of answering, he asked, how do you know that the City of Silver thinks that you are the fool? He didn't dare to say that the City of Silver still suspected that the fool was the god that Amon believed in, afraid that he would provoke him. Of course, if Amon was the type of person who would lose his intelligence after being provoked, he definitely would have tried doing so. This was because he now suspected that, after gaining initial control of Sapphira Castle, he would be reborn above the grey fog after his death. Unfortunately, Amon wasn't a king of angels from the storm pathway, but a god of trickery that gave even the true deities a headache in the fourth epoch. Amon laughed and said, do you think I only have 2 avatars in the City of Silver? Since you, the fool, and the hanged man have intervened, then I'm happy to quietly watch from the sidelines. The City of Silver is still accommodating Amon's avatar. Who's the fellow who was parasitized? Yes, previously, the members of the Giant King's Court's exploration team weren't parasitized. This is something that can be confirmed. As his mind tensed up, Klein felt that it was only natural. This was because Leonard had once told him that seeing one Amon meant that there were a bunch of Amons lurking around. It wouldn't just be a small handful. Without much thought, Klein tried hard to come up with an attempt to create an opportunity. You didn't rob me of my destiny directly because you can't handle it right now. Amon nodded frankly and said, yes, that's why I want to make a deal with you peacefully. But since you rejected my offer, I can only bring you to see my real body, to a sufficiently safe place. Then, your destiny will be taken away. When that happens, your ending will not be as good as I just said earlier. As he spoke, the black-haired, black-eyed man with a broad forehead and thin face slowly got up and walked towards the door. With that, Klein stood up and followed behind like a puppet. As he reached out to open the door, Amon seemed to recall a question. He pressed down on the crystal monocle and turned to look back at him. What's the fourth line of your scholar of your honorific name? In mysticism, every existence's corresponding honorific name wasn't that strict. As long as one used the correct format and certain descriptions to narrow the scope to prevent any ambiguity, they could point towards the corresponding hidden existence. This was also why quite a number of heretics who knew anything about mysticism could randomly make up honorific names while still receiving feedback. Of course, if it wasn't for the honorific name given by the hidden existence, there was no way to enjoy receiving feedback. Whether they established a connection or not depended on whether the existence was interested in the supplicant. Previously, Amon had used his understanding of the scholar of Urin German Sparrow, and the powers of the Marauder Pathways Sequence 7 cryptologist, to restore the full honorific name that could point accurately to German Sparrow. However, he didn't attempt to pray and use the automatic response to establish a connection to lock onto Klein's location, because his godhood intuition told him that there was a problem with the fourth sentence, dooming him to fail. The fourth line of Klein's honorific name flashed across his mind, but he had no intention of telling Amon. At that moment, Amon opened his mouth and read out his thoughts. Protector of Backlund magic and drama performers, this so-called angel of time and blasphemer fell silent for a few seconds after saying it out loud. Then, he smiled, very happily. After laughing, Amon adjusted his monocle on his right eye and said with a smile, to be honest, this is all very interesting. Are you really not considering becoming my blessed? Klein opened his mouth and gave a familiar answer, kill me. Upon hearing Klein's reply, Amon smiled and shook his head. As he reached out to open the door, he casually asked, how did you think of such an honorific name? It needs to have a certain connection with myself, but also be able to avoid others from using the prayer's automatic response to lock onto me. There aren't many such honorific names. Seeing that his identity had been exposed, there was no need for Klein to hide it any further. Furthermore, he hoped to use such a conversation to grasp an opportunity. At the same time, his mind raced as he began thinking about how to save himself. I've been deeply parasitized. If I have any thoughts that aren't beneficial to Amon, it will be easily sensed and detected by him. Today is Saturday, and it's almost Monday again. If the fool suddenly stops the tarot gathering without any warning, the other members will definitely be terrified, nervous, and confused. Here, those who have the means to contact the world will definitely attempt to summon the messenger to ask for the reason. And once Miss Messenger approaches me, she will be able to discover the existence of Amon. Then, she can use the yesterday once again charm to recover to her peak condition. With the complete strength of an angel, she has a sizable chance of rescuing me from Amon's avatar. The most important thing for me now is to persist and live for 2 days. Yes, since Amon can't steal my fate right now, why did he try to trade peacefully? Even if I agreed to it, he wouldn't dare to let me go above the gray fog to grant him permission. That would mean that I'm free from his control and able to Sapphira Castle to effectively purify and make a counterattack against the parasite. Is the agreement itself a switch, and there's no need to follow up on it? Amon deliberately didn't mention this. As expected, it was a scam. Having grasped a sliver of hope, Klein decided to stall for time as long as possible for the next 2 days. The focus of Amon was still on the honorific name that no human and angel could think of. As he walked out of the room, he scratched his chin and said, "Have you provided any protection to Backlund's magic and drama performers?" I've protected a trickmaster before. Having made plans, Klein was much more cooperative than before. He answered simply, I'm a magician myself. I've performed many times in Backland. The monocled Amon nodded. Barely counts. He then walked out of the hotel room and went down the stairs to the street. Like a servant, he followed behind without any abnormalities. Looking to his left and right, Amon pinched his monocle and sighed with a smile. How regretful. What's there to regret? Klein asked in puzzlement. I've already been caught by you. What else do you have to regret? Amon pressed down on his silk top hat and maintained his smile. You can make a guess. If you can guess correctly, I can give you a better ending. Klein didn't believe in his promise at all. In order to not be tricked into revealing more secrets, he shook his head and said, I can't guess it. How boring, Amon said simply. He clenched his right hand into a fist and lightly tapped on his monocle. From the pedestrians, the trees by the side of the street, the sparrows on the rooftops, the rats in the muddy corners, and all kinds of living creatures in the air, illusory worm-like figures flew out, returning to Amon like stars. This son of a god status instantly rose to the level of an angel. As for Klein, he raised his left hand, and the human-skinned glove suddenly turned transparent. This was the activation process of traveling. At that moment, the only thing on him which was real was creeping hunger. The rest were made by using the powers of a faceless, as well as the glove using flesh and blood as the material. Seeing that traveling was about to begin, Klein was taken aback as he blurted out, why didn't you teleport in the room? He had expected Amon to leave Backland with him. After all, this was a place where even a king of angels had to be wary of. However, he couldn't understand why he would open the door, go down the stairs, and leave the hotel in such ordinary fashion. The eye behind the monocle swept across Klein as the corner of Amon's mouth slowly curled up. I've already answered you. What a pity that you didn't seek help from Palez. This angel of time had an obvious smile on his face, but there was no emotion in his black eyes. It made Klein shudder. He's certain that I have some connection with Palez Zoroast. Is it because of what happened the last time? No, stop it. Klein attempted to cogitate, trying his best to control himself from thinking too much, so as to prevent his thoughts from being stolen by Amon. Amon glanced at the panicking passers-by on the street in an impassive manner before looking up at the gray sky and saying, I can only wait for the next opportunity. The most important thing now is to bring you to that place. As they spoke, both of them turned transparent at the same time and vanished from the hotel's entrance. None of the people who came over felt anything amiss. After passing through countless indescribable spirit world creatures and overlapping layers of different saturated colors, Klein and Amon appeared above the sea. Beneath their feet was a huge fissure. The blue seawater had been cut off as they plummeted deep into the bottomless darkness, like a waterfall without ever filling it. This was the entrance to the ruins of the Battle of Gods. With a thought, Klein asked, You're taking me to the forsaken land of the gods? The magnificent waterfall was reflected in Amon's monocle. He nodded slightly and casually replied, That's right. When we get there, even your messenger won't be able to sense you through the contract. The forsaken land of the gods was clearly separated from the spirit world. Only by relying on Sapphira Castle could a connection be made. Amon knows what I'm planning to do. The flame of hope that was ignited in him was extinguished by the cold reality. He couldn't find another way to save himself for the time being. At this moment, the levitating Amon muttered to himself, If my mausoleum in Backland hadn't been destroyed by the Church of Steam, we could have used the abyss as a springboard to head there directly. We wouldn't have to go through all this trouble. Klein guiltily changed the topic. The abyss is connected to the forsaken land of the gods. No. Amon shook his head and said with a relaxed expression, But I can use some of its characteristics to go anywhere. I heard that there were some nasty changes in the abyss. With a thought, Klein probed. Amon turned his head and glanced at him without concealing his curiosity. You're actually aware? Yes, I once thought of exploring the abyss. Klein didn't speak further, afraid that the King of Angels of the Marauder Pathway would discover that he could read Roselle's diary. At this moment, Amon suddenly laughed. You want to explore the abyss? What's so funny about that? Klein was very interested in what had happened to the abyss to begin with, thus, he took the opportunity to cooperate with Amon in an attempt to know more. Just as he finished speaking, he suddenly had a new idea. Using the conversation he had with Amon, he could grasp more historical secrets to speed up his digestion of the scholar of your potion. That way, he could try using it to deepen his control of Sapphira Castle and escape from his current predicament. This thought flashed through his mind as he quickly restrained himself and stopped thinking about such matters. In regards to his question, Amon chuckled and said, Your visiting of the abyss is like offering yourself as a beautifully packaged gift to someone who wants it. Dark side of the universe? Klein was first alarmed before he made a guess. Amon nodded. He was originally the only surviving ancient god, the devil monarch, Farbody. Now, heh. Without finishing his sentence, Amon leaped and jumped into the huge, illusory rift with the strong winds. With that, Klein lost the support of the wind and fell straight down. After an unknown period of time, the water that resembled a fountain surged upwards rapidly, throwing him and Amon to the other side of the severed face. Just as he entered the ruins of the Battle of Gods, Klein was hit by bright sunlight. He suddenly heard a series of intense and crazy ravings. It was like a thin needle that pierced through his eardrums and stabbed into his brain, filling every thought with immense pain. As for the worms of spirit that formed his mythical creature form, they gradually changed, as though they were about to give birth to a degenerate consciousness that didn't belong to him. The true creator's ravings. With regards to this, Klein could barely withstand it, but it was difficult for him to hold on for too long. There was no way for him to go too far in the ruins of the Battle of Gods. At this moment, he saw that the monocle on Amon's right eye absorbed all the light around them. It became unusually bright and white. Then, a thick darkness ruled the sky. Amon directly stole the day of the ruins of the Battle of Gods. In the darkness, this Angel of Time's avatar brought Klein to an island and made him sleep against a stone pillar. Soon, Klein arrived in a hazy dream world. He saw the projection of the giant king's court, which was filled with an epic feeling, opposite the black cloister and the cliff. Amon, wearing the black silk top hat and crystal monocle, appeared beside him. With a relaxed smile, he pointed at the projection of the giant king's court that was frozen in the sunset. That's the entrance to the forsaken land of the gods. After some thought, Klein raised his doubts. Don't you need to enter a dream at a specific location to open the entrance? He couldn't help but feel a glimmer of hope again. He thought that it would be great if Amon wasted a week or two of his time in the ruins of the Battle of Gods. That's right. Amon didn't deny what Klein had said. He casually said, if you wish to open the entrance, you have to travel on a ship to the core of this ruin's waters. This might take more than a month, and you will experience many dangers that you're currently unable to withstand. As for me, I don't have to. Is it because you're the son of the Creator? Klein guessed in deliberation. No. Amon had one hand in his pocket as he turned to walk to the black cloister's entrance. In chaotic places like this, order is in shambles, and the laws governing them have mutated. There are too many things that can be exploited. As this Angel of Time walked, he turned to look at Klein. The Marauder Pathways Sequence 0 has a very abstract name, Error. It was named by my father. He once used a strange word of unknown origins to represent it, bug. When translated, it's a Trojan horse of fate, the slug of time, the loopholes in rules, the manifestation of all errors. Chapter 1153, 1153 Chapter 1153 The Sunset Tunnel Sponsored Content Font Big Middle Small Previous Index Next Add Bookmarks Error. Bug. Is that the essence of the Marauder pathway? As he came to a realization, Klein also confirmed one thing. That was that the ancient sun god, the City of Silver creator, Amon's father really did come from Earth. The word that Amon said was standard English. Fellow Earthling, your two children have really caused me so much pain. If only they were all like Bernadette. As he lampooned inwardly, he asked curiously, you want to use this dream world's loophole? Klein controlled himself and didn't use the term bug to describe it, lest it would arouse suspicion in Amon due to his overly ordinary fluency when speaking the word. He would then reveal a trump card for no reason. Faced with a king of angels who could steal his thoughts and deeply parasitize him, he had very few trump cards to begin with. He had to make good use of every single one of them. Who knew when they might end up being effective? At that moment, Amon had already walked out of the black cloister. He had one hand in his pocket, and without doing anything, the heavy door opened automatically, as though it was welcoming the arrival of a distinguished guest. You can think of it that way, but in actual fact, it's a little more complicated than that. Amon didn't show the might of a blasphemer at all as he casually answered Klein's question, this dream world doesn't have any errors, or rather, loopholes. It's just that, due to the clashing of remnant divine powers, some places appear more chaotic. And I can use this chaos to create a loophole. As the huge door that was prepared for the giant was completely opened, Amon pinched his monocle and walked into the hall, venturing deep inside. During this process, he smiled and gave a more in-depth explanation. You should know very well that this cloister is composed of dreams. Yes, it comes from the dreams of different living beings in the ruins of the Battle of the Gods. After some thought, Klein added, it might also be left behind by some dreams from the past. Download our sponsor's game and get $30 reward. Remove ads. At that moment, the man and angel walked on a winding black staircase. The light of dusk shone through the stained glass from high above, bringing with it a feeling of burning holiness. Amon touched the human skull engraving on the railings and smiled as he took in the surroundings. Generally speaking, the area you enter this dream world is where you end up when waking up, regardless if you're in the dreams of other living beings in other seas. Unable to nod, Klein could only express his opinion with words. That's right. And after I create a loophole, I can wake up in the corresponding location by entering other dreams. Clearly, this cloister is much smaller than the sea ruins outside. The structure is even narrower. Perhaps, we can reach our destination in a few minutes. There was a hint of joy in Amon's tone. To him, creating and exploiting loopholes was a joyous matter. Amon is actually able to use such a method to quickly pass through the ruins of the Battle of the Gods. We won't even be wasting an hour or two, much less 1 or 2 weeks. As expected of a king of angels, the blasphemer of the fourth epoch. The glimmer of hope that was generated in Klein vanished instantly. He wasn't sure if Amon had deliberately not mentioned it in advance, so as to enjoy watching the bubbles of his target's hope being popped time and time again. Or if he didn't care about such trivial matters. All he could do was to curb his heavy depression and say, you want to control the core dream of this illusory world. He remembered Queen Mystic Bernadette mentioning that she didn't dare enter the black wooden door in the deepest depths of the cloister. It's not me, it's us, Amon replied with a smile. He seemed to suddenly recall something. He raised his hand to adjust his monocle and asked with interest, why did you put a monocle on your marionette? I didn't even need to prepare one myself. Feeling awkward for a second, Klein thought for a second and decided to answer truthfully, not long ago, in order to digest the Bizarro Sorcerer potion, I deliberately wore this monocle in front of the Red Angel evil spirit. Amon, who was walking down the stairs suddenly paused. He turned his head to look at Klein and smiled. Download our sponsor's game and get $30 reward. Remove ads. Very interesting. This angel of time said thoughtfully, to think that Medici hasn't completely died. Next time, if I encounter him, I'll disguise myself to look like you, and then I'll wear a monocle in front of him again. Poor Sauron Einhorn Medici. As a whole king of angels, can you not be so senseless? Is this the so-called God of mischief? When Klein heard that, he felt wistful, not knowing what to say. Amon pressed down on the crystal monocle and asked, "Did you wear this monocle on your left eye? How did you know?" Klein was shocked, imagining that Amon had stolen the scene from the fog of history. "How did I know?" Amon said with a smile. "There are two possibilities. Firstly, it's because you're of a beyonder of a low level, so you're definitely not a match for that fellow Medici. You were afraid that if your disguise was too realistic, then you would incur a fatal subconscious attack and deduced that you would be better of doing so. Secondly, if you had the intention of imitating me and ended up doing an accurate imitation, then I might be able to use the ripples generated by fate to detect the incident. Since I didn't notice it, it must mean that the monocle was worn on the wrong spot. Make a guess. Which possibility is it? I will choose the most dangerous possibility, regardless of whether it's true or not. This way, I will be even more careful and cautious in the future when it comes to matters like this. Of course, there must be a future first. Since Amon didn't show any signs of viciousness or oppression. Klein had unknowingly let down his guard and felt that Amon was an easygoing king of angels. But now, he suddenly snapped to attention as he came to a realization that this was a trait of a master swindler. The second possibility. Klein gave his answer. Amon didn't say if he was right. He reached the bottom of the stairs and came to the lowest level of the cloister. He stopped in front of a black wooden door covered in strange patterns. I've been here before. Once this door is fully opened, the power inside will shatter the dream world in its entirety, Klein said as he attempted to extract more historical secrets from Amon. Amon reached out for the handle, his thin face impassive as he said, "This is my father's final dream. The corresponding location is where he perished. The ruins of the Battle of Gods was where Ro's redemption attacked the ancient sun god, the source of the cataclysm." When Klein heard that, he tensed up as his thoughts raced. With regards to this answer, after understanding the formation of Ro's redemption, he had a corresponding theory regarding the various abnormalities in the ruins of the Battle of Gods. He wasn't too shocked now, and the scholar of your potion had even been digested to a certain degree. Immediately following that, he let out an indescribable sigh. Download our sponsor's game and get $30 reward. Remove ads. This was the closest he had gotten to the ancient sun god. Previously, when he saw it through dream divination, they were separated by a distant stretch of both space and time. The ancient sun god and Emperor Roselle were the protagonists of an era, but in the end, they ended up miserable. The ending was tragic. Roselle still has the means of being revived. I wonder if this former creator had any similar setups. Dark Angel Sasra. The true creator. Amidst his thoughts, Amon opened the black wooden door covered in strange patterns. There was a sea inside, and the blinding sunlight shot straight at it. There seemed to be a rich gold color hidden in the waves. Klein didn't understand what the thick gold represented previously, but now, he had a preliminary idea. It was the blood of the ancient sun god. Before he died, he was affected by the power of the Evernight and fell into a dream. He dreamed of his body being torn apart, staining the sea with blood. Clang! As the black wooden door opened, an unimaginable aura emanated out, causing the entire cloister to violently shake, as though it had encountered an earthquake that could destroy this world. Amidst the dust and collapsed stone bricks, the two of them entered the golden sea through the wooden door. Following that, he felt his spirit body melt as his psyche evaporated. In seconds, he would become fertilizer for the dream. At this moment, bright and pure white light shone out from Amon's crystal monocle, instantly shattering the dream world. He returned the day he had stolen to the ruins of the Battle of the Gods, allowing the place to turn from night to day. At the same time, his and Klein's figures turned somewhat transparent. Then, they appeared in midair above a sea that was dyed golden. The temperature here was higher than what Klein imagined, but it wasn't as dangerous as the dream. Download our sponsor's game and get $30 reward. Remove ads. Or rather, the sea in the core region of the ruins of the Battle of the Gods was separated into safety zones due to various clashes of divine power. As long as one didn't blindly explore the area, then there wouldn't be too much of a problem. In the next second, Amon's monocle drew in all the light from his surroundings, making himself appear extremely bright. Day was stolen and night had fallen once again. After the two landed on an island in a safe zone, they once again entered the dream world. This time, they appeared outside the black wooden door covered with strange patterns. Amon adjusted his monocle, which he wore on his right eye, and pulled it with his left hand, stealing the distance between the entrance and the cloister. Both of them took a step forward at the same time, leaving the cloister and arriving at the edge of the cliff. Opposite them was the projection of the giant king's court that was frozen in the dusk. Klein originally thought that Amon would follow procedure and chant the corresponding honorific name, but to his surprise, he only raised his right hand and snapped his fingers. The clouds that separated the two mountains instantly boiled as they parted to the left and right, revealing an invisible dark rift at the bottom. The projection of the giant king's court on the opposite side suddenly sucked all the rays of light from the sunset over, letting them surge forward and fill up the deep crack. Hence, in between the two mountains, an orange-red light road appeared in the clouds. "Let's go." Amon gave a low laugh as he leaped down the cliff. With the fluttering of his clothes, he landed on the passage formed by dusk. Unable to resist, Klein could only follow and jump down the cliff. If you find any errors, broken links, non-standard content, etc., please let us know so we can fix it as soon as possible. Tip: you can use left, right, A and D keyboard keys to browse between chapters. Note: please download the sponsor's game to support us. Chapter 1154, 1154 Chapter 1154 I'll give you a chance. Sponsored content. The path that was formed by dusk didn't seem to contain anything, but after Amon and Klein landed one after another, they didn't continue falling, as though they were walking on the ground. This time, Amon didn't steal the distance. Instead, he brought Klein along as they approached the majestic projection of the giant king's court. From time to time, he would observe and admire the beautiful scenery. Walking above the sea of clouds, they walked along a sunset bridge with the legendary palace in the distance. It was supposed to be a joyful and refreshing matter, but Klein felt as though he was walking into the abyss, doing so one step at a time. The more he struggled, the deeper he fell. Once he entered the forsaken land of the gods, many things that he relied on would be useless. Before long, Amon and Klein arrived at the projection of the giant king's court and stood in front of the tallest building. On one side of the building was a steeple, and on the other side was a spire. The main door was far more than 10 meters tall, with it being mainly a grayish-blue color. It was covered with symbols, labels, and patterns. It was where the giant king lived, the place where Dark Angel Sasra slept. Klein glanced at the pitch-black hole to the left of the door, roughly determining that the door in the dream didn't need a key to open. Otherwise, the true Creator's believers wouldn't have been able to pass through. After all, the actual key back then was in Vice Admiral Iceberg's collection room. Next, we'll be able to enter the forsaken land of the gods once the door is opened. However, we'll definitely attract the attention of others by doing so. Amon chortled and took a few steps diagonally to the edge of the door. "We won't open the door, but instead directly head over." As he spoke, the Angel of Time raised his hand to adjust his monocle. A dark blue color appeared in the corner of the grayish-blue door. It was an illusory door without any sense of being corporeal. The door-opening power of an apprentice is a very low-level ability, but it's perfect when used here. Amon lowered his right hand and introduced in satisfaction. Taking 2 steps, he passed through the illusory door. There are no useless beyonder powers, only useless beyonders. If I directly push the door open, I'll draw the attention of others. But from who? The true Creator. His holy residence, his divine kingdom should be somewhere in the forsaken land of the gods. If I can lure him over and let him clash with Amon, I might be able to find a chance to escape. Without any ability to control himself, Klein followed behind Amon without leaving much of a gap, stepping into the blurry dark blue door. The moment he stepped through, he felt the world spin around him. Even his spirituality seemed to be torn apart. After the abnormality disappeared and his condition was restored, he realized that he was on a beach that was soaked in the glow of the sunset. Download our sponsor's game and get $30 reward. Remove ads. The sand and stones here were all black in color. Deep blue waves surged over from afar as they crashed into the coast, one wave after another, but they didn't produce any sounds like they should have. They were quiet, like a grand illusion. This sea is an illusion. Coming in would probably result in one appearing here, but it's not necessarily the case for leaving. According to the principle of reciprocity, if one wants to leave, they can only open the residence of the giant king, where Dark Angel Sasser is in deep sleep. With a sudden realization, Klein turned his head and looked in another direction. It was a mountain bathed in dusk. On it were countless palaces, towers, and many majestic city walls. This was the legendary Giant King's court. Even if the City of Silver could find a path that leads to the beach, it would be meaningless. From the corner of his eye, he saw that Amon had changed his image. He wore a black classical robe and a pointed hat of the same color. He changed from being a gentleman from the present era to an ancient mage that originated from the 4th or even the 3rd epoch. With a thought, Klein continued looking at the Giant King's court which wasn't too far away. He casually said, "Dark Angel Sasser is sleeping in the palace of the Giant King." Amon stood to his side as he looked in the same direction and said without any change in expression, "I know. I've entered the Giant King's court and even visited the graves of Ormer's parents." As expected. One of Klein's guesses was finally confirmed. He deliberated and said, "What answers you searching for one? You can make a guess." Amon continued looking at the Giant King's court and laughed. "If I had any idea, I wouldn't need to ask you." After thinking for a few seconds, he said, "Some secrets of the 1st epoch." "You can say that," Amon replied without much concern. Klein hesitated for a moment before saying, "Aren't you curious about Dark Angel Sasser's condition? Download our sponsor's game and get $30 reward. Remove ads." "I am." Amon didn't change the direction of his gaze as he said with a smile, "But compared to me, there are still many people who are more interested in that, my zealous brother, the Hanged Man, the Dragon of Betrayal, as well as Evernight, Storm, and White. I want to see who's the first one who isn't able to hold back. Heh, if I can steal everything of importance inside at the critical moment, their expressions will definitely be very interesting." This thought. The reason for stirring up such a huge matter was purely to cause trouble, to gain some excitement. Klein frowned slightly and realized that Amon's values were different from that of humans. This is a natural mythical creature. Completely different from humans. Why can I frown on my own? Just as he came to a realization, he sensed that something was missing in his body. He subconsciously turned his head to look at blasphemer Amon. There was a semi-translucent worm of time with 12 rings in Amon's hand. He smiled as he looked into Klein's eyes and said with some anticipation, "Since we've already arrived at the forsaken land of the gods, there's no need to worry about external interference. I'll give you a chance. Before I reach my true destination, I will no longer parasitize you. You can use every method that you can think of to escape, and I will try my best to stop you. Good luck. Don't disappoint me." For a moment, Klein couldn't believe what Amon had just said. He suspected that Amon was bluffing him. But when he thought of Amon's behavior all this while, he felt that it was something that was in line with his character. All right. As his thoughts raced, he took a deep breath and solemnly replied under the orange glow of the sunset. Backlund, Parliament House. Due to King George II's sudden self-destruction, none of the nobles and members of Parliament were allowed to return to their respective homes. Instead, they were gathered here to receive heavy protection from the three churches and the military. Dressed in a pure black dress, Audrey stood behind the railing on the second floor and quietly looked down. As the matter had happened too suddenly and lacked any prior warning, she still found it surreal despite receiving some indication from the world Gehrman Sparrow. She seemed to have transcended reality and was watching a performance. Download our sponsor's game and get $30 reward. Remove ads. Her father, brother, and the other nobles and members of Parliament were gathered in cliques as they occupied different small rooms. From time to time, one would walk out of the small room, bringing with them the stench of smoke and their gentlemanly attire as they rushed to another discussion circle. The ladies and madams sat in the lounge. Most of them had yet to return to their senses as their eyes were dazed and their bodies trembling. The parliamentary staff and the military's middle and low-ranking officers were running about everywhere, transmitting information from different places. A soldier dressed in a red shirt and white pants walked in from the outside and handed a stack of paper to the officer in charge of the hall. The officer glanced at it and immediately called for his assistant. He pointed at the small room where Earl Hall and the rest were in. Without asking anything, the adjutant took the documents and ran towards his destination. All of this happened in a very quiet environment. Only the sound of footsteps and faint whispers echoed in the air. It was as if it was a huge oil painting drawn on the canvas of the real world. The gorgeous decorations, dark colors, dim lights, and the expressions on everyone's faces created an extremely heavy atmosphere. Audrey pursed her lips slightly and looked at it for a while. Her mood was still at a nadir, and she only managed to maintain her calm by relying on placate. Why would Mr. World deal with the king? The death of the king will definitely bring deep hatred. It doesn't matter what sequence the king is, because he has never shown it. This doesn't affect the overall strength of the kingdom, but this incident is enough to explain one thing: the three churches, royal family, and military have fractured apart. The internal strife is quite serious. The situation with Lone will be very dangerous. Its enemies will definitely not let this opportunity go. As her thoughts raced, she saw a man in a black coat rush into Parliament House. He suppressed his voice and started talking to the officer in charge of the lobby. As an experienced spectator who could observe the subtle expressions and body language, reading lips was undoubtedly Audrey's strength. As she watched, she interpreted the corresponding content. Intis has used the excuse of conflict in the borders of the Homasis mountain range to gather a large number of troops there. Audrey bit her lip lightly as that familiar feeling of not belonging there arose again. It was as if she had seen a novel's description play out in the real world. The grayness of the sky seemed to grow thicker. No one spoke in the house where the Morettis lived. Download our sponsor's game and get $30 reward. Remove ads. Benson stood behind the oriel window with a solemn expression as he looked at the people rushing down the streets. It was unknown what he was thinking. Melissa sat on the sofa beside the coffee table. She lowered her head and looked at the crude machinery she made. It was as if she had become a statue. Sigh, the situation has become even more chaotic. Benson exhaled as he touched his hairline. He turned his head back and forced a smile. Regardless, Backlund is definitely safer than most places. Melissa didn't raise her head. Instead, she said with an ethereal voice, Klein found a good job, and our lives gradually improved. In the end, an accident took him away. We moved out of Tingen, and you got a job as a civil servant. I entered university and started on the correct path. In the end, war broke out. It wasn't easy for us to get used to this environment. We were praying that the war would end early. In the end, the king was blown to pieces. Having said that, Melissa slowly lifted her head and looked at her brother with a confused expression. Benson, is it that difficult to obtain and maintain a better life than what we had before? If you find any errors, broken links, non-standard content, etc., please let us know so we can fix it as soon as possible. Tip: you can use left, right, A and D keyboard keys to browse between chapters. Note: please download the sponsor's game to support us. Chapter 1155, 1155 Chapter 1155 Walking in the Dark Sponsored Content Backland, Eastborough. Furs, who had just returned from the land of ice and snow, was wrapped in thick layers of clothing. She looked at the burning charcoal stove in front of her as if she had fallen into a terrible environment again. She couldn't help but shiver a few times. George III is already dead. The things that happened before will definitely come to an end. Perhaps we can move out of this place and head to Northborough or Hillstonborough. The houses there have fireplaces. Zio sat on a chair opposite her and similarly stared at the warm furnace. She replied with a slightly confused expression, "Let's wait another week or two. To be honest, I still can't believe that George III was killed so easily. I didn't have time to do anything." This bounty hunter, who had become a judge, sounded disappointed, confused, and puzzled. It felt as though she had lost her motivation in life. Furs temporarily forgot about the damage caused by the cold as she consoled her. "I don't think that this was done by Gairman Sparrow. It was done by those people who used Charmaine. They were the only ones investigating the secret motives of George III. Your actions have contributed to his death to a certain degree. It's as if you had exacted your revenge in an indirect manner. There shouldn't be any more surveillance or suppressive measures placed against your family. You can try to start a new life. If you have the chance, you might be able to use proper channels to make an appeal for your father." Upon hearing the last few sentences, Zio raised her head. "Yes, the situation is getting more and more chaotic now. I'm worried that they'll be affected by the war. Furs, do you think it's safer to be in Backland, or in an ordinary city that isn't near the borders?" Furs thought for a few seconds and shook her head calmly. "I don't know." She added, "I plan to ask Mr. World. He must have a better grasp of the overall situation. Do you still remember? He warned us beforehand that something would happen around George III, and to avoid approaching him. Download our sponsor's game and get $30 reward. Remove ads." In addition, Furs also wanted to ask where the next stop of her travels would be so that she could make preparations early. "Yes." Zio nodded instinctively. Furs flipped through the newspapers she supported with her knees, and she drank the coffee she had left. Then, she slowly got up and entered the room inside. She prayed to Mr. Fool in a low voice, asking him to pass her questions to the world Gairman Sparrow. In the forsaken land of the gods, near the giant king's court. Without being parasitized at a deeper level, Klein followed Amon to the foot of the mountain. In the frozen dusk, they circled to the front of the mythical land. Although Amon had given him a chance to escape, he wasn't in a hurry to do so. This was because he knew very well that Amon had the strength and level of at least a sequence 2. He was an angel in the truest sense of the word, an entity he couldn't fight head-on. Besides, a marauder was known as an error, a loophole, a bug. Its powers were very strange, making it impossible to guard against. Klein believed that whatever normal means he could come up with to save himself would be ineffective. "I can only stay patient and wait for an opportunity that can be used. During this process, I have to keep making attempts to observe Amon's response. Yes, I still have to take note of a problem. I can't believe anything Amon says. He has already retrieved the worm of time and removed my parasitized state. At least, in terms of my condition, he isn't lying, but this might not be the whole truth. I can't rule out the possibility that he has left a worm of time lurking in my body. He might take control of my body at a critical moment." As these thoughts surfaced in Klein's mind, he chatted with Amon, asking about Dark Angel Sasra. However, he saw that nearby, in the distance, the dusk was fading away as darkness blanketed the area. Lightning bolts that snarled from time to time lit up half the sky. They had arrived at the boundary of the giant king's court and were about to leave the mythical kingdom. Once I'm in the darkness, I'll either evaporate into thin air or encounter a sudden terrifying monster attack. With a thought, Klein pretended not to know anything as he continued proceeding forward. He went from the orange dusk and into the deep darkness. At this moment, Amon, in his black classic robe and pointed hat, accompanied with a monocle, reached out his hand and pulled back a lantern covered in thin animal hide. Inside the lantern, a candle made of some unknown oil emitted a faint yellow light and a slightly pungent smell. "Carry it." Amon threw the lantern at Klein. Klein caught the lantern and fell silent. A few seconds later, he probed, "Where did you get this from?" Download our sponsor's game and get $30 reward. Remove ads. At that moment, Klein imagined that Amon had summoned a projection from the historical void. Amon pinched the crystal monocle and said with a smile, "I stole it from the human camp up ahead." "Oh, that's the City of Silver's afternoon town camp." It was stolen. Klein's eyelids twitched. He didn't ask further as he carried the lantern into the endless darkness. The dim yellow light was like an invisible defensive barrier as it quickly spread out, creating a warm zone in the dark night. At this moment, the lightning in the sky kept flashing. The gap between them was rather long, and there was almost no thunder. It occasionally boomed. According to the general knowledge he had learned from Little Sun, this was nighttime in the forsaken land of the gods. It was the most dangerous period. As he proceeded forward, he first used the faceless powers which had undergone a qualitative change. Together with creeping hunger, he adjusted his eye structure to adapt to this special environment. Following that, he used his spiritual perception to survey his surroundings. He felt that, in the darkness, there were many eyes staring at him, with creatures of indescribable shapes hidden. However, every time the lightning lit up and shone brightly, there was nothing. He wasn't worried at all about the serious backlash from using creeping hunger while not feeding it. From his point of view, there were only two outcomes. One was that creeping hunger attempted to devour him, but had its thoughts stolen away by Amon. The second was that creeping hunger successfully devoured him, the wearer, allowing him to be resurrected, thus, escaping from his current predicament. The latter was something he was looking forward to, while the former didn't offer any losses, other than leaving creeping hunger somewhat perplexed. After proceeding forward for a while, he saw the City of Silver's afternoon town camp that was built using an abandoned building. Beyond those boulders and walls that were formed by stone pillars, the bonfire quietly burned and illuminated most of the areas inside, making them completely different from the outside world. The members of the City of Silver's exploration team were either patrolling or watching the area under the light's illumination to prevent any accidents. One of them was a Dawn Paladin who was nearly 2.3 meters tall. He was standing at the top of a stronghold and looking into the distance, wary of the monsters hidden in the darkness. Suddenly, he saw a faint yellow flame coming from afar in the darkness. This Dawn Paladin's pupils dilated as his heart raced. Download our sponsor's game and get $30 reward. Remove ads. Apart from newborns and children who had yet to receive education, everyone in the City of Silver knew that this land had been forsaken by God. No one else would use fire in the darkness to create light. Even monsters who were good at controlling flames would be hidden in a dark environment before they attacked. As for the other humans, all the cities that the City of Silver had discovered to date had already been destroyed and turned to ruins. There were no survivors. The only outsider they had seen to date was the strange little boy, Jack. And at that moment, a flame appeared in the depths of the darkness, one that was constantly moving. What does this mean? The Dawn Paladin who was standing in the stronghold couldn't think of anything at that moment. He could only feel his body trembling slightly. The dim yellow light slowly approached from afar. It passed by the campsite and headed beyond Afternoon Town. Vaguely, the dawn knight saw two silhouettes that belonged to humans. They walked deep into the darkness, and their silhouettes were strangely illuminated by the light. Holding what looked like a lantern, they slowly left the camp and disappeared into the endless darkness. At some point in time, the Dawn Paladin was already holding his breath until the faint yellow light was completely gone. There are other humans? No, they can't be humans. The Dawn Paladin's eyes narrowed as he carefully turned around to inform the elder of the 6-member council presiding over this camp. At this moment, he discovered that one of the lanterns hanging on a stone pillar was missing. This Dawn Paladin's body stiffened as cold sweat broke out on his forehead. As he walked away from Afternoon Town, Klein endured the stares of numerous pairs of eyes in the depths of the darkness. He secretly made use of the powers of a scholar of yore, as well as his connection with Sapphira Castle, to sense the grayish-white fog that was interwoven through history. He had succeeded. This proved that the forsaken land of the gods wasn't isolated from Sapphira Castle. The holy residence of the true Creator, or even the divine kingdom, is located in this piece of land. If I were to trigger Sapphira Castle and create an anomaly, would it cause him to cast his gaze over and clash with Amon? He is a true god. I don't have extravagant hopes in escaping in the chaos, but I can seize the opportunity to commit suicide when he is dealing with Amon. With a thought, Klein wanted to make Sapphira Castle quake slightly. In the next second, this thought disappeared. Download our sponsor's game and get $30 reward. Remove ads. The corners of Amon's mouth curled up slightly as he walked beside him. The hanged man has no interest in Sapphira Castle. Of course, his rationality might not be constant. Klein didn't have extravagant hopes that his impulsive thought could truly succeed. He mainly wanted to test Amon's reaction and see what his response was. At that moment, he didn't feel depressed, nor did he hide his curiosity in asking a question. The hanged man is referring to the sequence 0 of the Shepherd Pathway. Amon nodded slightly and said, "That's right. This symbolizes degeneration. Of course, if you want to explain it in a positive light, that is sacrifice and responsibility." Klein thought for a moment before probing. "I thought this was a nickname you came up with. Just like Medici." Based on what he knew, the true Creator was born because of Ro's redemption. It was very likely related to the death of the ancient sun god. Therefore, he wanted to know what kind of attitude Amon had towards this evil god, and whether it was the same as his brother. Amon nudged his monocle and chuckled. "I've always respected the gods. To have a blasphemer say this sounds really contradictory." Helpless, Klein put a stop to the topic. "If you find any errors, broken links, non-standard content, etc., please let us know so we can fix it as soon as possible. Tip: you can use left, right, A and D keyboard keys to browse between chapters. Note: please download the sponsor's game to support us. Most of the areas in the Forsaken Land of the Gods didn't have paths that one would consider normal, but it wasn't that difficult to walk through them. This was because large swaths of the land were barren. Everything was mostly black in color. On the moors, there were occasional sightings of plants that stubbornly grew. They were of a variety of strange shapes and distorted sizes. Klein had no way to tell what they originally were. Around them, in the areas that the lantern couldn't illuminate, the darkness seemed to have a life of its own. It seemed to move silently, as though it wanted to devour everything that they could blanket. As a scholar of yore, Klein just needed one glance from the corner of his eye to see the spirit-body threads extending out from the darkness around him. They were illusory, dense, and countless. This meant that there were many monsters lurking in the darkness. These monsters were extremely silent. They stared at Amon, who was dressed as an ancient mage, as well as Klein, who looked like a present-day gentleman. Under the dim yellow light, they walked through the wilderness. With his eyes fixed ahead, Klein casually held the animal hide lantern in his hand, not worried about when it would be extinguished. Just as the two of them were about to leave this barren wilderness and enter a hilly region, a deformed monster of mangled flesh with 2 heads and 5 arms suddenly trembled in the darkness behind them. It had become Klein's marionette. Controlling spirit body threads was silent to begin with, and it wasn't more than 500 meters away. In the next second, the monster collapsed silently, losing its life. Walking to Klein's left, Amon, who was wearing a pointed hat, smiled. He raised his right arm and opened his palm, revealing something. It was a transparent maggot with 3-dimensional patterns. A worm of spirit. This was stolen from the marionette, along with the spirit body threads. Without waiting for Klein to speak, Amon easily crushed the transparent maggot with his fingers. Klein immediately felt a pain that came from deep within his soul. His head felt like it was about to split open. Thankfully, he had gotten used to this feeling from him repeated creating yesterday once more charms and control spirit bullets. He only grimaced without losing his composure. Amon maintained his smile and threw down his palm. "You're too reserved. You can be more daring." Having recovered from the pain, Klein raised his hand to rub his temples, feeling exhausted. Every worm of spirit was calling for him to rest. As he was being chased by Zeradal, the spirituality that he borrowed from his past self had been mostly expended. There was still the continuous traveling after that. By using Angel's Embrace to remove traces, he was already nearing his limit. After he returned to a safe zone, he had planned on going above the gray fog to check on his surroundings before entering a deep sleep and replenish his energy. Alas, he ended up suffering an ambush from Amon, which resulted in him being parasitized. He had been tormented all the way to the forsaken land of the gods. If he wasn't in a perilous situation, he might have fainted or showed signs of losing control. "I need to rest now," Klein put down his right hand and said frankly. He believed that Amon would satisfy his request, because the more he failed at escaping despite trying his best, the more he could satisfy this god of mischief's desire for entertainment. "All right." The monocled Amon's face turned slightly as he said while facing the hillside, "There's a resting place there. We'll arrive soon. Of course, I don't mind if you want to camp out in the wilderness. I just feel that you humans might prefer a place that gives you a sense of security. Let's go there." Klein originally wanted to directly control the flame of the lantern to complete a flaming jump, but his drained spirituality stopped him. He could only follow Amon and rely on his feet to move forward. Along the way, with a mind of asking more questions, he said to Amon, "Why don't you steal the distance to immediately arrive at our destination?" Amon turned his head and glanced at Klein with his monocled right eye. The corners of his lips curled up slightly. "I'm not the one who wants to rest." Klein shut his mouth and quietly walked forward. After about 10 bolts of lightning flashes, Amon raised his hand and pointed diagonally ahead. "We're here." In the shadow of a hill less than 100 meters away, there were a few buildings that looked like half-steeples. More than 10 giant stone pillars protruded out from the ground, reaching only the height of Klein's knees. A few strands of wild grass grew out from the crevices, their blade-like tips were dark red like blood. "There used to be people living here?" Klein rubbed his temples and asked. Nudging the monocle with his right index finger's second joint, Amon smiled and said, "This place used to be a very large city. When the cataclysm happened, the land cracked open and devoured the entire city, leaving behind only these structures to prove that it once existed. The destruction of civilization." This thought suddenly popped up in Klein's mind. He sped up his pace and arrived at the destination where there was strange wild grass. After entering a half-collapsed building, Klein instinctively looked around and observed the place. The grayish-white stone walls that had cracked open had murals that had been washed away by thousands of years. They were already indiscernible, and he could tell that the people in the city believed that entering heaven after death was an honor. After regulating his breathing, Klein threw away the animal hide lantern in his hand. Leaning against a thick stone pillar, he barely managed to imagine layers of spherical lights. He didn't care about the dangers of sleeping in such an environment. Let the danger come, strike harder. Before he fell asleep, Klein shouted in his heart. The black-robed Amon glanced at him before casually sitting down beside him and snapping his fingers. The candle that was about to burn out in the lantern stopped melting, but the dim yellow light continued to spread. Despite only having fuel to last a few more minutes, it seemed to be able to last another few hours or even days. It was like an error that violated the laws of nature. After for an unknown period of time of feeling groggy, Klein finally recovered his energy and was woken up by Miss Magician's prayers. He was temporarily unable to respond to this. He closed his eyes and pretended that he was still dreaming. Without being parasitized at a deeper level, I don't think Amon can monitor my thoughts. He can only tell if my thoughts are harmful to him. With a thought, he secretly summoned the grayish-white fog. He had borrowed a state from his past self through the historical void, a state that wasn't directly meant for escaping. That was when Vin Rambus invaded his island of consciousness. This attempt wasn't stopped or stolen. Using this state, and the fact that he was able to maintain his lucidity in dreams and the mind world regardless of any intrusions, he split a portion of his self-awareness and stayed in the spiritual sky, calmly looking down at the island. He began to examine if there were any abnormalities in his mind and thoughts that were being parasitized. After a series of strict comparisons, he confirmed that there was nothing wrong with his mind world. In other words, even if there was still a worm of time in his body, it was still considered being parasitized at a superficial level. It was impossible to monitor his thoughts. After finding such a safe zone, Klein finally released his repressed thoughts and analyzed the current situation. He considered the subsequent methods for self-preservation. Amon is a god of mischief and also a god of deceit. It's impossible that he is playing this game purely for his entertainment. If he really wants to do that, he can definitely wait until he meets with his true body and steals my fate. He can attempt it after obtaining Sapphira Castle. That way, even if something unexpected happens, his main goal will also be achieved and he wouldn't suffer any losses. What is his goal behind this matter? If I can grasp the crux of the matter, I might be able to discover true freedom. Also, after he recited the luck enhancement ritual incantation in Mandarin, he actually didn't show any concern towards this special language, nor did he ask any questions. This totally doesn't match the sense of curiosity that he portrays. Did he deliberately use the word bug to probe me, so as to see what connections I'll make, but he didn't steal my thoughts? No, if all my ideas are disjointed from one another, I wouldn't be able to discover that they've been stolen. Klein recalled the situation back then, and he used the logical connections between his thoughts to confirm that he hadn't had his thoughts stolen. This made him confirm one thing, that was, that being parasitized at a deeper level, Amon could directly monitor his thoughts without stealing it. Amon made it seem that he had to notice malintent before he took action. It was a bluff. I knew it. This deeper level of parasitization seems to be different from what Palez described. Based on this deduction, the thoughts that I've been thinking of along the way have been heard by Amon, including Earth, fellow Earthling, and child education. How terrifying. Thankfully, when I was plotting to destroy the advancement ritual of George III, I had imagined the perilous situation of being parasitized by Amon. Half of my thoughts were my instinctive reactions, while the other half was intentionally let loose. This way, not only do I reveal my secrets, but I can also use this to gain Amon's trust, concealing the most important and core matters. For now, he definitely knows that I plan to obtain more historical secrets from him, so as to quickly digest the scholar of your potion. However, he doesn't know that I'm not far from being able to fully digest it. I'm just a few steps short or just one opportunity away. Did Amon deliberately remove the parasite and play such a game with me because he had once heard of Earth from the ancient sun god and had come into contact with some secrets? He plans on using my attempt to save myself to complete certain matters that might be inconvenient or impossible for him. If that's the case, there will definitely be something happening next. Yes, I have to show that I didn't notice this and still plan on escaping like a normal person. Once I've returned to my optimal state, I'll make my first attempt. After a while, Klein opened his eyes. The pointed hat-wearing Amon sat beside him and smiled at him. Have you decided? When are you going to take action? He acted as if he was Klein's partner and not the target from which Klein was trying to escape from. Chapter 1157. Poise. Klein pressed down on the grayish-white wall and slowly sat up straight. He smiled and shook his head. Before I fill my stomach, my brain refuses to work. He was speaking the truth, and also a lie. This was because, before becoming a complete mythical creature, a saint would still be hungry and thirsty. But to a Sequence 3 demigod, not eating or drinking for half a month wasn't a problem. As for a whole mythical creature, eating was only a hobby, not a necessity. What he wanted to express was that, before he officially made attempts at escaping, he needed to be in optimal condition. The habit of a magician, Amon commented with a smile. I'm not in charge of providing food, but you can think of a solution yourself. Looking at the lantern on the ground, Klein thought for a few seconds before reaching out his right hand into the air. A not-so-tall coffee table immediately appeared in front of him. It was an item from the residence belonging to Dwayne Dantes. Under the dim yellow light, Klein reached out once again to summon a beautifully packaged box from the historical void. Inside the box was a set of cutlery, including a knife, fork, and cup. The reason why he chose this item was because he couldn't form a set of cutlery by individually summoning them. He could only maintain 3 images from the historical void at the same time. After setting up the cutlery in a leisure manner, Klein politely turned his head to the side and nodded at the pointed hat-wearing Amon. Following that, he summoned a medium well-done steak covered in black pepper sauce. It landed on the porcelain plate, emitting some steam. With him slicing the steak with the knife, he revealed the remaining edge of the pink protein. Klein forked a piece of beef and stuffed it into his mouth. He felt that the texture was real and the texture was succulent. It wasn't fake at all, as it really calmed the anxiety of his stomach. For 15 minutes, not only will I not feel hungry, but I will also receive real provisions. After swallowing the piece of beef, Klein smiled and introduced it to Amon like a hospitable host, and not a pitiful beyonder who had been kidnapped. Amon pressed against the crystal monocle and nodded with a smile. I've tried it. It's not bad. Your ability to adapt is really quick. Are you really not considering being my blessed? After cutting another chunk of beef, Klein forked it up and replied as though he was chatting with a friend, kill me. At that moment, the relative frequent lightning and endless darkness ruled the land. Wherever the light from the surroundings couldn't shine on, eyes were staring at the area with zero emotion. The twisted, dark red grass gently swayed in the occasional breeze. In the half-collapsed building, the dim yellow light painted the artistic coffee table and the exquisite cutlery with warm colors. The aroma of the steak wafted in the air, not showing any contrast with the outside world that was continuously connected to it. Under the gaze of the terrifying monsters in the depths of the darkness, Klein enjoyed a sumptuous meal in a refined and poised manner in the desolate land that was soaked in extreme terror. After finishing his steak, he summoned a small glass of iced wine from Mager Manor and drank it in one gulp. Following that, cream soup, pan-fried cod, tender lamb stew with peas, baked potato skins, and all sorts of grape wines were summoned one after another before entering Klein's stomach. During this process, the steak that was the first to be eaten had already been maintained for a long period of time. It had vanished into thin air, but Klein's stomach and body were numbed by the subsequent food and he was oblivious to it. Of course, the coffee table and food were replenished. Otherwise, they wouldn't have lasted to the end of his meal. At the end of the meal, Klein continued reaching out his hand, pulling out a cup from the void. Inside was a ball of vanilla ice cream. He then used the spoon to scoop the ice cream into his mouth, feeling it melt with its delicious sweetness. After the ball was finished, he still wasn't satisfied as he summoned another ball of ice cream from the historical void. As such, he ate 5 different flavors of ice cream in a consecutive fashion. When Klein reached out his hand for the 6th time, Amon, who was sitting on his side, suddenly laughed. "Your fate has had an abnormal change. You're lucky enough. Is this your preparation?" Klein's right hand immediately froze in midair. His pupils seemed to dilate to a certain extent. Almost at the same time, in the darkness around them, where the lanterns couldn't shine, strange creatures twitched and instantly became Klein's marionette. This time, Klein sent out 100 worms of spirit in one go, hoping that one of them would be lucky enough to avoid Amon's theft. Right on the heels of that, behind the coffee table, a figure wearing a black coat and no hat was replaced with a disgusting vampire covered in pus. The artistic coffee table and exquisite cutlery shattered like glass that had been smashed to the ground. Countless cracks appeared and shattered. They quickly returned to the historical void, just in case it affected Klein's subsequent summoning attempts. In the next second, the 100 marionettes, along with the Klein, who had hidden somewhere, reached out to grab at the void. He attempted to avoid Amon's interference with quantity. At that moment, they were all scholars of yore. This was the ability of bizarro sorcerers, the source of the qualitative change of a seer. Of course, the chances of success of each marionette summoning was independent, so there was no influence each had with the other. At that moment, the projection that Klein was summoning was the projection of Rionette Tinker, who had recovered to her peak state in the Tudor ruins. Due to the contract and charms, she was the easiest angel projection he could summon from the historical void. Amon was still sitting leisurely in his spot. His monocle emitted a faint glow as he watched the 101 Klein summon at the same time. With his right hands reaching out in an orderly manner before being retracted, none of his 100 marionettes succeeded. He didn't drag Rionette Tinker out of the void. At that moment, Amon raised his right hand and also grabbed ahead of him. His arm sank slightly, and he casually pulled it back. Outside the half-collapsed building, a huge cloth doll that was as huge as a castle appeared. It was wearing a dark and complicated long dress, bound by vines. Ancient Bane Rionette Tinker. Amon had stolen the historical image that was summoned by Klein. Rionette Tinker's red eyes immediately reflected the figures of Klein's 100 marionettes. Without a sound, the marionettes, that were either disguised with Klein's appearance or in the state of a monster, emitted a faint glow, turning into homed mountain goats, white rabbits, and other different animals. Transformation curse. Klein's actual body had long disappeared. Then, he walked out of the flames that rose up from the animal hide lantern. He looked at the various animals that might be considered his and suddenly sat down and chuckled. Taking a stroll after a meal effectively improves one's health. He didn't mention anything about his attempt to escape, as if nothing had happened. Amon maintained his relaxed posture and nodded cooperatively. "I've read quite a number of books written by humans. There are indeed such opinions among them." With that said, he raised his hand and pointed at the projection of Rionette Tinker. "This is your messenger." This was something that could be easily confirmed, so Klein didn't hide it. He tersely acknowledged and nodded. What a pity. Amon sized up Rionette Tinker's projection and shook his head with a tsk. As he felt the food in his stomach disappear, Klein asked, "What's the matter?" "I should bring you to Backland to wait for a few more days. That way, I can wait for your messenger to deliver a letter to you. Then, she will become my messenger." Amon nudged his monocle on his right eye and said with a smile, snatching an angel messenger. "That will be very challenging and fun, isn't it? Life needs some fun, excitement, and anticipation." "I share the same thoughts," Klein replied sincerely. "What a pity." The hatted Amon shook his head again. "Eve Might is someone I need to be careful about. If we stayed there any longer, even I wouldn't have any idea what would happen. As he spoke, this angel of time dispelled the historical void projection of Rionette Tinker, allowing her to vanish in front of Klein. You seem to be very wary of the goddess. Klein pretended to be a devout believer of the Evernight goddess. Of course, he didn't need to don a disguise. He was still a blessed of Evernight. Amon's gaze shifted to the lantern inside the half-collapsed building and looked at the dim yellow light. I'm unable to steal things that I'm curious about from a concealed state. I can't decipher what other arrangements she might have and what the key thing to take note of are. To a king of angels of the Marauder pathway, there was sufficient reason to be apprehensive. Taking advantage of the opportunity while Amon was answering his question, Klein suddenly recited the honorific name of the Evernight goddess in Jotun. You are the Evemite goddess who stands higher than the cosmos and more eternal than eternity. Just as he said that, his thoughts were lost. If he hadn't had such plans previously, he wouldn't have known that he had made such an attempt. Amon turned to look at him and said with a smile, "Are you trying to sound me out, believing that I'll also repeat your words after stealing your thoughts and words?" At Sequence 4 Parasite, one is able to control the stolen items and make them appear at a suitable time. Is that so? Klein nodded gently. Thank you. As he spoke, Klein quickly summarized his experience and lessons of his escape attempt. Because the existence of the contract and their subordinative relationship, summoning Miss Messenger is the easiest amongst all the angels I know. Summoning the ice cream from the past can establish a subtle connection with he who represents fate, and allow me to be blessed with luck. Yes, every ball of ice cream represents a portion of my luck. I originally planned on summoning ice cream as a cover to secretly summon the Snake of Fate. In the future, the summoning had to be done with a certain degree of interference. Otherwise, Amon would be able to directly steal the historical void image I summon. It would only be giving him a helper after going through so much effort. Just as his thoughts raced, Amon pointed at the bunch of animals that had been cursed by the transformation curse, and he said with a slightly evil smile, "Aren't you worried that there won't be any suitable food in the forsaken land of the gods? There it is, as long as we don't dispel the curse, they're real animals." Klein was stunned as he suddenly looked at the goats and the white rabbits. With him willing them, the animals looked at him simultaneously. In a sense, they were all himself. After all, they were combinations of worms of spirit and monsters before being hit by the curse. Chapter 1158. Coming to terms. After silently staring at the rabbits and mountain goats for more than 10 seconds, Klein closed his eyes and flicked his right index finger and middle finger as if he was pressing an invisible piano key. A third of the marionette collapsed, losing the feeling of being alive. Klein's expression immediately warped, as though he had been struck 33 times by a giant sword. The familiar and extreme pain he felt swept through his spirit body, causing light-colored meat tendrils to sprout on his body. Every sprout seemed to be forming a transparent maggot. This was the backlash from killing 33 worms of spirit. After taking nearly 15 minutes to recover, Klein made his second attempt at letting the other third of his marionettes die. The same pain, the same time to rest, and the same actions were repeated again. Finally, he completely finished off this batch of cursed marionettes. He couldn't handle it all at once because the damage caused by the death of 100 worms of spirit was enough to make him lose control. And being cursed meant that he couldn't directly solve the problem by retrieving the characteristics. Of course, this was the standard of a scholar of yore who had just advanced recently. It wasn't the performance of a scholar of yore who was almost done digesting the potion. In fact, the loss of 100 worms of spirit would only worsen the pain, without him showing any signs of losing control or affecting the battle. He was only acting just now, allowing his performance to match his role. At his level, losing half the number of worms of spirit that he had at the same time would lead to losing control. Once he completely digested the scholar of your potion, he would be able to recover from having nearly 500 worms of spirit die at once. Even if he lost all the corresponding Beyonder characteristics, he wouldn't lose his status and level. He could slowly recover his strength by absorbing the beyonder characteristics of the seer pathway. After completing this, the recovered Klein walked out of the half-collapsed tower-like building. He went to the darkness outside and brought back a few white rabbits and a goat. He then realized that the darkness in the forsaken land of the gods wasn't as dangerous as Little Sun had described. Most of the monsters were weak. No, to be precise, the danger lurking in the depths of the darkness, apart from making people evaporate into thin air, nothing else can compare to the fellow beside me named Amon. Klein glanced at the thin man who was sitting near the lantern, smiling as he watched him busy himself. He summoned something like boiled water from the historical void, and he squatted down, seriously removing the fur and flesh from the white rabbits and goat. After a series of tasks, Klein set up a bonfire. He set up a barbecue rack that came from history, and he placed a white rabbit on it. He brushed it with a full set of condiments he made himself, like basil, fennel, and salt, as he constantly turned the meat over. At this moment, the delicacies from the historical void he had eaten before had long disappeared due to him no longer maintaining their existence. His body and soul were calling out for replenishment. A tempting fragrance was gradually emanated as Amon's nose twitched slightly. "You're really eating them?" Without waiting for his reply, the god of mischief continued, "They're essentially the flesh of monsters and your worms of spirit. Are you sure you want to eat them? There's no way to undo the curse at the level of an angel. If there's no way to resist or correct it at the same level, there's no way of dispelling it. Since a thing looks like a rabbit, smells like a rabbit, and tastes like a rabbit, it's a rabbit." As Klein seriously roasted the rabbit, he gave a self-deprecating laugh. "Besides, how can I not maintain the best state if I want to escape from your grasp? For this sliver of hope, I can only challenge my psychological limits. This is what it means to endure humiliation and suffering," Klein added inwardly. At the same time, he sighed at the ancient Bane's transformation curse. This was many times stronger than a sequence 3 disciple of Silence's curse. There's almost no limit to the amount of time it can be maintained. Clearly, an ordinary animal can use all of my beyonder powers through the worm of spirit, but a deformed marionette due to a curse isn't possible. This is a curse at the angel level. Apart from putting up resistance from someone at the same level, one can use the correct method to remove it. No curse is irreversible. There are always loopholes. Heh heh, will kissing this rabbit turn it into Gehrman Sparrow? Klein made a self-deprecating comment as he analyzed to compose himself. After hearing his reply, the monocled Amon nodded with a smile. "Very good. This is indeed a good revelation to have." Klein didn't respond as he resumed his barbecue. Not long after, with the help of flame controlling, he finished roasting a rabbit and a goat's leg. Taking advantage of the opportunity before the condiments disappeared, he matched some sweet iced tea he summoned from the historical void with the food, filling his mouth with fragrance. It nourished his body and mind, allowing him to effectively relieve the pressure, despair, and indecisiveness from being kidnapped by Amon. During this process, he would occasionally recall the disgusting looks of the monsters, as well as the fact that the worms of spirit were equivalent to himself. However, he was able to bring his feelings under control very well. After filling his stomach and replenishing his energy, he turned the remaining ingredients next to the fire into dry rations, as though he was saving up for his subsequent plans. Seeing him slowly but orderly making all sorts of preparations, Amon suddenly nudged his monocle and asked with a slight smile, "In actuality, you're trying to stall for time before we reach the actual destination, right?" Klein's hands paused for a moment before he continued with his actions. He smiled and said, "Yes, I'm waiting for help." "Guess who?" Amon didn't answer directly as, he said with a smile, "I'm looking forward to it." Klein continued his work until he prepared rations for 3 or 4 meals. He thought for a moment and once again reached his hand into the void in front of Amon. He failed again and again as he kept making attempts. It was unknown what item he was trying to summon, but it seemed like he was using his actions to dare Amon into stealing it. After watching for a few seconds, Amon smiled and shook his head. He slowly stood up and walked out the half-collapsed tower building. Klein's right hand stopped in mid-air before he retracted it and pinched his forehead. He muttered to himself in puzzlement, "What was I trying to do just now?" While trying to recall, Klein stood up as well. He brought along his packed rations, picked up the animal hide lantern, and walked to the back of Amon's side. The man and Angel circled around the hill and entered a valley. The water was sloshing in the river, but when the dim yellow light shone at it, or when the lightning in the sky lit up the area, Klein realized that there was no water in the riverbed. The sounds he had heard earlier had also disappeared. A river that has been transferred into a concealed state. After some deliberation, he raised a question to Amon. "That's right. It will only appear in darkness void of light," Amon replied with a slight nod, unfazed with the question. "Can I drink it?" Klein pressed. Amon smiled and said, "Sure." This was once one of the water sources of a city that had persisted for 1,600 years in the darkness. As long as you can bring the water away from the riverbed, they can appear in places with light. Your next move is to suggest that I bring the lantern to wait by the side while you hydrate yourself in the darkness. And then, take this opportunity to transform into a concealed state. Klein smiled awkwardly. How could I use such a simple method? Hearing that, Amon laughed and stroked his monocle. Sometimes, the simplest plan is the most effective. You can give it a try. With regards to the words of this peerless swindler, Klein couldn't believe it, nor did he dare to believe it. He was afraid that the other party was using reverse psychology with the truth. He could only put the matter of the water aside and ask, in the forsaken land of the gods, how many human gathering points, like the city of silver, have yet to be destroyed? Amon looked ahead and said without changing his expression, "The ones I know don't exceed 10. In this aspect, the city of silver is lucky. At least, they can see and have the ability to touch the light. This means that the city of silver is very close to the giant king's court, the door leading out of the forsaken land of the gods. There's no need to risk death to reach it. As for the other cities, no matter how steadfast they are in the darkness, no matter how many exploration teams they send out, it will all be futile. There's no way to find the exit. Indeed, from this angle, the city of silver is unfortunate, and also lucky. This is purely dependent on the reference point." Klein held the lantern as he proceeded along the bank and began coming up with his second attempt at escaping. Amon walked beside him, occasionally providing him with ideas that seemed reliable but had unknown actual results. He appeared to be suffering from schizophrenia, trying his best to destroy his true body's hopes in obtaining Sapphira Castle. On the other side of the giant king's court, in the city of silver. After receiving the chief's summoning call, Derek Berg brought the unshadowed crucifix to the top of the spire and entered a spacious room. There was a mysterious and complicated altar set up here. Different items were placed in different spots, a total of 6 items, each of them emanating a dangerous aura. With a glance, Derek saw an ordinary silver flute, a mask made from a skull, and the remains of a deformed person. "You have the unshadowed crucifix. You can stay here for 15 minutes, but you can't exceed that time. Otherwise, you will suffer a sudden death." Colin Iliad wore a linen shirt and a brown coat as he exhorted Derek. Derek's spiritual perception was triggered as he asked, "Your Excellency, is this because of that twilight mask?" His right hand pointed at the mask made from a skull. "Yes." Colin nodded slightly and said, "I've already prepared the remains of 6 powerful creatures. These were all hunted by myself, or with me as the main force." Derek was immediately enlightened. "You still lack the blessings of a deity?" Colin instantly fell silent. After nearly 10 seconds, he opened his mouth and slowly said, "Yes." After some hesitation and struggles, he finally chose the fool. At least those mushrooms had given the city of silver hope. Derek suppressed his joy and thought back to the interactions at the Tarot Club. He raised a question in puzzlement, why didn't you let those two god-level sealed artifacts give you their blessings? He remembered that subsidiary gods, or angels, could satisfy the requirements of the ritual. It wasn't the case that only a sequence 0 true deity could provide blessings. After all, a silver knight was only a sequence 3. Colin fell silent again and hesitated for a few seconds before saying, "They won't give blessings." Chapter 11:59 Validation. They won't give blessings. Derek was a little confused by this answer, not fully comprehending it. Back in the afternoon town camp, when he handed the Silver Knight potion formula to Chief Colin Iliad, the other party had praised him for making a huge contribution. He believed that the upper limit of the City of Silver was no longer that of Sequence 4, and his tone didn't reveal the need to seek blessings from external sources. Hence, Derek had always believed that the chief would be able to use the two god-level sealed artifacts to complete the Silver Knight's advancement ritual. Now, it was inevitable that he was surprised. Back then, the chief didn't know that the two god-level sealed artifacts couldn't provide blessings, and he only realized this problem when he returned to the City of Silver. Derek subconsciously made a guess and didn't ask further. He nodded heavily and said, "All right, I will try my best to help you seek blessings from a deity." Demon Hunter Colin exhaled silently and pointed at the door. "There's no one in the room opposite." Derek turned around and passed through the corridor, entering the half-open room. Then, he took a seat and recited softly, "The fool that doesn't belong to this era. The mysterious ruler above the grey fog. The king of yellow and black who wields good luck, inside Sapphira Castle, and hidden within the grey fog, the crimson star representing the sun rapidly expanded and contracted." It kept repeating the process, producing rings of please. And not far beside it, the crimson star representing the magician remained in the same state because of the fool's lack of a response. The circular rings, ripples, and tremors that the two created intertwined and became more intense. Under the illumination of the bolts of lightning, Klein carried a leather lantern and walked into the valley. He suddenly felt that the illusory pleas in his ears became even more chaotic and louder. However, he realized that he had heard it clearer than before. Not only could he tell that the plea came from a woman and a man, but he could also vaguely make out certain content. The woman seemed to mention the world and backland. The man used Jotun, and the keyword seemed to be a ritual. Ritual, Jotun. That's little son. That chief wishes to receive Mr. Fool's blessings. Mr. Fool also needs some blessings right now. The woman might be Miss Magician, but I can't rule out Miss Justice either. The corners of Klein's mouth twitched in embarrassment. He turned his head to look at Amon in the pointed hat and monocle, and he said, "Can I pop over to Sapphira Castle to answer a prayer? What do you think?" Amon was taken aback as he asked in amusement. "Since you want to play such a game, why won't you let it be more exciting?" In fact, Klein didn't have any hope regarding his request. This was because, as long as he could return to Sapphira Castle, he could use the power there to make the first step in escaping from his predicament. This was equivalent to getting Amon to just set him free. The reason he mentioned this was because he wanted to use this to start the subsequent topic. Amon nudged the crystal monocle with his knuckle and chuckled. "As the god of mischief, I've been alive since the third epoch. I believe you know what that means." "Yes, what do you want to ask? This is an accurate grasp of my state of mind and thoughts." Klein sighed and asked, "Why did you parasitize the City of Silver's exploration team back then? You even patiently stayed in the dungeon for decades." Amon nodded and replied in a relaxed manner, "I had a premonition that the City of Silver would obtain extremely important information. Now, this prophecy has come true, right, Mr. Fool? He did all of that just to wait for me in the Tarot Club. From the looks of it, this Marauder Pathway's King of Angels can see the disturbances in fate caused by Sapphira Castle to a certain extent." Klein had never expected the answer, leaving him momentarily at a loss as to how to continue the topic. After about 10 seconds, he sighed and said, "You're really patient." He was a king of angels who liked to play pranks, Yet, he actually stayed inside a dark dungeon without any sources of entertainment for decades. This has nothing to do with patience. It didn't take too much of my time, Amon casually replied. I'm still used to using a human standards when talking about a deity. To Amon, who was born as a complete mythical creature, a few decades is nothing. He might even be more than 3,000 years old. Klein regulated what he knew and asked again, the City of Silver is one of the few places that persist on believing in your father. Aren't you going overboard with what you did to the expedition team? This question didn't seem to be necessary, but Klein believed that it would aid him in understanding Amon's thoughts and style, doing so in order to see if there was anything that could be used. Amon turned his head and glanced at him with his monocled right eye. He said with an indifferent smile, if it wasn't for their faith in my father, the City of Silver would have already been reduced to ruins. According to my observations, they're hiding quite a significant secret. As for what it is, because of the gaze directed by you and the hanged man, I haven't had the chance to pry into it, a true-born mythical creature. The deaths of just a few humans might be equivalent to trampling a few ants to death. He wouldn't take it to heart at all. The City of Silver actually has a secret that even Amon thinks is a big secret. What could it be? Klein thoughtfully changed the topic. Was Dark Angel Sasra really created from your father's rib? This was something that Klein had wanted to ask the entire time, but he hadn't found the opportunity to ask. The smile on Amon's face faded as he looked at the darkness in front of him. Yes, he separated a portion of his characteristics and corresponding negative personalities. He used his rib as the material to create Dark Angel Sasra. If that wasn't the case, how could a proud and arrogant person like Medici obey the so-called left hand of God, the deputy of heaven? Without Sasra's rebellion, implication, and influence, even if Evernight, Earth, God of combat, and the other kings of angels joined forces, it's impossible for my father to perish. Indeed. Dark Angel Sasra is the most key factor in this matter. It's no wonder the goddess wanted to bewitch him at the very beginning. Who would have thought that he would betray himself? Klein's initial speculation of the battle of gods had been confirmed. He felt his scholar of your potion digest a little more. He deliberately hesitated and made a guess. Could your father have foreseen such a development? Dark Angel Sasra is also the key to his resurrection. Amon suddenly laughed. You asked so many questions in order to further digest the scholar of your potion, right? Klein pretended to break out in cold sweat, and he quickly adjusted his state of mind. I'm just curious. What are you looking for in the forsaken land of the gods? What are you pursuing? The Marauder Pathway Sequence 1 Beyonder characteristic that you're missing isn't here, nor is Sapphira Castle. Are you trying to revive your father? Amon maintained his smile and looked straight ahead. Yes, and no. My zealous brother is already very close to reviving my father. He probably doesn't need my help anymore. Adam really wants to revive the ancient sun god. I thought that he was purely doing it for the sake of becoming a Sequence 0. Without hiding anything, Klein called out the name of the Twilight Hermit Order's leader. He was even looking forward to Adam beating his younger brother up. Of course, beating someone up wasn't in line with the style of a king of angels of the spectator pathway. There's no need to mention his name. He won't interfere with my matters, nor will I interfere with his. I don't address him as Adam, because I think that a nickname like Zealous is very suitable for him. I have to say that Medici is very talented in giving nicknames. Also, even if I say his name, he wouldn't be able to hear it if I don't wish for him to hear it. At this moment, the monocled Amon smiled as he exposed Klein's idea. Following that, Klein didn't mention the Dark Angel any further, because it was obvious that Amon wouldn't answer. Before long, the man and angel walked out of the valley and saw a silent city. More than half of the buildings in this city had collapsed. The remaining ones had a sharp roof, as though they were towers that led to heaven. On the surface, dark red vines and plants grew, forming fruits whose edibility was unknown. After entering the city, he discovered that there were stone coffins placed in front of each house. Inside were skeletons or recently rotted corpses. A common point between them was them being greatly deformed. Some had 4 legs, some had a slit in the middle of their eyebrows, some lacked skin, directly revealing their flesh, some had arms wrapped around their necks like tails. This was originally a city that believed in the phoenix. Later, it converted its target of faith to my father, but it retained some customs related to death. The monocled Amon casually sized up his surroundings and said, after the cataclysm, they were left behind in the forsaken land of the gods. However, there were no edible, relatively normal plants around them, so they could only eat those corrupted monsters. Over generations, their bodies began to produce defects and psychological problems. Eventually, they were completely wiped out. The cataclysm brought about by the goddess's assassination of the City of Silver's creator really was a calamity for civilization. Before that, there were elven, giant, phoenix civilizations, and so on. After that, all that's left are traces of them. When Klein thought of the city that had been swallowed into the ground, he sighed. In the history books, in mysticism, it was very apt to call that history, the cataclysm. He paused for a moment before asking, why are we entering this city instead of going around it? Amon smiled and said, in the second epoch, apart from wielding the death pathway, the phoenix ancestor also occupied part of the apprentice pathway. Some of the decorations here can become a loophole that I can make use of to shorten our journey to our final destination. Klein's expression immediately darkened. Chapter 1160 Improving City of Silver, at the top of the spire. After waiting for a long time, Derek still didn't receive a response from Mr. Fool. This made him panic a little. He didn't understand what this meant, nor did he know how to deal with it. Mr. Fool is in a state where he can't respond to his prayers. Yes, he informed us 2 days ago that the gathering next week would be cancelled. This should be a sign. Having recalled what happened previously, Derek barely managed to calm his anxiety and nervousness. He couldn't be blamed for having such a huge reaction, because the City of Silver's textbooks recorded similar situations. The creator who normally responded to his believers suddenly stopped responding and forsook this land. After a few seconds of silence, Derek stood up and returned to the room where the chief was. He said to Colin Iliad, we have to wait a few more days. Wait? Demon Hunter Colin repeated the keyword as he frowned slightly. From his point of view, this was an unusual matter, seemingly symbolizing a bad development. Derek resisted his instinctive reaction of scratching the back of his head, and he nodded with some difficulty. Yes. The grizzled Colin Iliad stared at him for a few seconds before nodding slowly. All right, head back first. Backland East Borough, inside a 2-bedroom rental apartment. Furs, who was wrapped in thick clothes, paced around the warm stove, her face full of doubt. Finally, she turned her head and looked at Zio. Why hasn't Mr. World replied? Perhaps he's preoccupied with something, Zio explained the reason she had long considered. Perhaps it's because it's not convenient for Mr. Fool to pass on your prayers. He has temporarily paused the gathering. Furs nodded thoughtfully and said, Mr. Fool informed us that the gathering will be temporarily paused next week. It was only decided in the middle of the week. Is this related to George III? Recalling Mr. World's investigations all this time, Zio acknowledged and said, very likely. In the forsaken land of the gods, in the dead silent city. Dressed in a classic black mage's robe, Amon led Klein into a relatively complete cathedral. Segmented stone pillars lay tilted, and dark red weeds grew out from their cracks, wrapping around the avian sculptures. With the animal hide lantern in hand, Klein surveyed the area and confirmed that the residents of this city weren't truly dead. There were still a few survivors left. He had no idea what method they had used to transform into monsters of the deep darkness. They were hiding from the faint yellow light, surrounding a cathedral in a place that couldn't be seen. They wanted to attack the 2 ordinary-looking humans, Klein and Amon. The reason why Klein was able to confirm that these monsters were originally residents of this city was because their spirit-body threads had a certain abnormality. Some were grayish-white, some were distorted, and some were sticky. They were completely different from the monsters elsewhere. They greatly resembled the corpses inside the coffins. I don't know what kind of despair and mental breakdowns will make the remaining humans choose such a path. Perhaps the deepest sense of despair was that they couldn't see hope on a daily basis while the situation around them worsened. With a sigh, he made use of this opportunity to adjust his mentality. He was experiencing various instances of hope surfacing, only to be met with despair time and time again. The monocled Amon walked to the edge of the light and walked all the way into the deepest part of the cathedral. Klein followed behind and saw a door covered in pale white light. This city is actually split into two parts, light and darkness. They're using certain abilities of the apprentice pathway to hide a portion of the area. They have to use a specific door to enter, Amon said as he pointed ahead. A secret sorcerer's powers. With some realization, Klein nodded, indicating that he knew what was going on. Amon then said, behind this door is the dark side of this city. I can use it to connect to a similar region far away. We can directly arrive there and shorten our journey. As expected of the incarnation of loopholes. Klein watched as Amon stretched out his left hand and pressed down on the door formed from pale white light. The light began to ripple as it rapidly spread outwards, becoming more and more intense. At that moment, a deformed monster hiding in the depths of the darkness while spying on the cathedral suddenly trembled, becoming Klein's marionette. 20 or 30 seconds ago, Klein had already completed the process of obtaining initial control over it and deepened his influence. However, he waited until now before he completely converted it. Right on the heels of that, Klein and the marionette reached out their hands at the same time. They took advantage of the opportunity when Amon changed the door, and they grabbed something. In his hand was something in the shape of a full moon, and was embedded with scarlet gemstones, the scarlet lunar corona. In his marionette's hand was an ancient, brass-colored master key. At the same time, they opened their mouths and made a bang sound. They used air cannons to push the scarlet lunar corona and the master key to the door of light. These two items combined could make one hear Mr. Door's pleas for help. This also meant that Mr. Door's powers could enter the real world to a limited extent. And this was the controller of all doors. He was one of the existences who was most unwilling to see Amon become an terror or control Sapphira Castle. Klein didn't expect that the sealed Mr. Door could really hurt Amon. He only hoped that he could use this opportunity to interfere with the Angel of Time and create a good enough opportunity for himself. Of course, if Mr. Door could cause any abnormal changes to the door, magnifying or distorting the loopholes created by Amon, thus, affecting the King of Angels of the Marauder pathway and teleporting him far away, Klein would definitely sincerely thank Mr. Door for a week. After his previous attempts, Klein realized his greatest disadvantage. It wasn't that he was one sequence short and had a qualitative gap in power level. Instead, he had lost the initiative and couldn't make proper preparations. Every time he began preparing, he would be interrupted or foiled by Amon. For a veteran magician, unprepared performances were often synonymous with failure. If he could make preparations in advance, he could quietly summon Mr. Azek's, Rionette Tinkers, and Snake of Fate Will Occepton's historical projections. Against a sequence too, even if there was no way to deal with him, it would definitely create a very good opportunity to escape. At that moment, the scarlet lunar corona and ancient-looking master key whistled through the air and arrived at the door of light. The white light that formed the illusory door distorted and devoured the two items. It was dyed crimson as it collapsed into a whirlpool. It was as though the bottom of the vortex was invisible, like a gigantic eye. Just as Amon was about to turn around, he made a slight pause as if he had heard an old friend's shout. However, this pause disappeared instantly, as though it had never appeared. With Amon's gaze directed at Klein, the latter instantly lost 6 beyonder powers. This included the control of spirit-body threads, the summoning of historical void projections, paper figurine substitutes, flame controlling, underwater breathing, and bone softening. Of course, losing these 6 beyonder powers for a marionette didn't affect Klein's subsequent operations. The indiscernible pause from before had allowed Klein to switch places with his marionette in time. He had already arrived deep in the darkness outside the cathedral. The deformed monsters around him trembled and turned into his marionettes. For targets such as these that weren't even sequence 5, it took only 2 or 3 seconds for Klein to transform them into marionettes. And by the time he summoned the Scarlet Lunar Corona, he had already begun doing similar actions. As he enjoyed the darkness without any scruples, he attempted to transform into a concealed state or successfully commit suicide. At the same time, he reached out with his marionettes to grab at the fog interwoven with history. This time, he split the marionette into 3 groups, summoning Rionette Tynker, Mr. Azek, and Snake of Fate Wiloseptin, respectively. He didn't want to follow his past mistakes, where he had managed to succeed with great difficulty only to have them taken away by Amon. With such arrangements, he might be left with 1 or 2. Of course, the premise was that Amon was unable to steal multiple historical void projections at once. This was something that Klein needed to confirm. Klein retracted his hand, but he didn't grab anything. All the marionettes who summoned the Snake of Fate failed. Among the scholars of your groups who summoned the Death Consul and Rionette Tynker, 2 of them had their arms tense up slightly. Klein was delighted as he suddenly felt that this attempt could end up turning into a real escape attempt. At this moment, the crystal monocle that Amon wore emitted a terrifying light. The entire city, including the surrounding rivers, hills, and wilderness, were all filled with pure, scorching sunlight. Day had once again descended upon this land after bidding farewell to it for thousands of years. Amon had stolen that day from the ruins of the Battle of Gods. In the face of such a day, not only did Klein feel like his body was about to melt, but he also heard familiar and crazy ravings in his ears. They were like steel needles that pierced through every worm of spirit. This caused his mind to be filled with immense pain. His marionette summoning attempts had failed while on the brink of success. That day, in the battlefield of the gods contained the true creator's ravings. The deformed monsters that were hiding deep in the darkness, which were the few survivors of the city, seemed to temporarily regain their senses. They stared blankly at the day, and couldn't help but narrow their eyes. Then, they wildly charged towards the source of that day, melting one by one into dust. Far away in the City of Silver's afternoon town campsite, the guards at the stronghold also noticed that there was a light coming from the northeast. It was different from lightning, just like the scene of the sun rising from the legends. This scene only lasted for a few seconds before it shattered and the sky returned to its dark state. As soon as he recovered from the ravings, Klein saw the pointed-hatted Amon standing in front of him. This angel of time nudged his monocle and smiled. "Well done.